Continuing our look at rights, we now turn to our good dead friend John Locke. Was born in 1632, died in 1704, and is still dead today. He was born into a Puritan family, and he went to school at Oxford studying theology, and of course Oxford is still in existence. He also studied natural science, philosophy, and medicine, and was described by some as a man of turbulent spirit, clamorous and never contented, which would make sense given that he became something of a philosophical revolutionary. Now, when he was attending Oxford, Oxford was, at least the philosophy parts, were dominated by scholasticism, and that's an older philosophical view, rising during the medieval era, and he found it to be perplexed with obscure terms and useless questions. And so he was intent to revolt against that. He read the works of Descartes on his own because at this time Descartes was, a philosophical rebel and outsider. And now, of course, Descartes is, an old philosophical establishment. For a while, Locke was a lecturer at Oxford in Greek and rhetoric, and afterwards he went on to lead quite a public life. In 1667 through 1683, he served as a doctor and advisor to Lord Ashley, who later became the Earl of Shaftesbury. He held a variety of political offices, and in 1669, he helped draft a constitution for the Carolinas in the United States. Now, what about his political views? Well, they were influenced by revolution because the Parliament of England and the throne had been struggling with each other for decades. Locke sided with parliamentary rights, and in 1683, he fled to Holland, which is where generally if one lived in England and one was in trouble, one would go to Holland. See, for example, the Pilgrims, because Holland was known for its tolerance. So in 1683, James II took the throne, and Locke departed. In 1689, which was right after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and this revolution replaced James II with William of Orange, Locke returned back to England, holding various political offices. And in 1691, he ends up retiring. He ends up writing quite a few works. His best known, his most famous works include the 1690 Two Treatises of Government, which is his political works, which would have been enough to make him really important and famous. And this is his work in politics. And he wrote another work that was published in 1690, which is an essay concerning human understanding, where he focused primarily on his epistemology, his theory of knowledge, and his metaphysics, the nature of reality. And this book was also hugely influential philosophically, still important today. Our concern, of course, was his ethics, or focusing on his two treatises of government. He also wrote letters concerning toleration, and then in 1693, some thoughts concerning education, 1695, the reasonableness of Christianity. After retiring in 1691, or partially retiring, he moved about 20 miles outside of London, and then in 1704, he died, and as I mentioned, he's still dead today. So, what's his political philosophy? Well, he wrote, the massive two treatises on government, so we're not going to go through all of it in just this short slice in an ethics class. But here are some of the key concepts. So the background for this is that there are those supporting a more democratic government and a Protestant monarchy, and their primary opponents were those supporting a Catholic absolute monarchy. Locke's political theory was not created ex nihilo out of nothing, and it's seen by many as he presents a brilliant summary and enhancement of ideas that were already floating around, and it's seen as his major contribution is combining them all together into something that is understandable, and also, of course, developing these ideas as well. So his two treatises on government were originally published anonymously in 1690, And the preface states that it was intended to justify the 1688 revolution, but people have noted that he'd been working on the essays for several years. So he'd been working on it well before then. Like Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he makes use of the method of the state of nature. In the state of nature that he accepts has the usual sort of basic features of a state of nature. It's a time prior to government, or if you want to do an apocalypse, which he doesn't, you could have it after government has been destroyed. So there's no government, people are free and independent, and everyone is equal. Now, he does differ a bit from Hobbes as we'll see, in terms of how awful the state of nature is. Now, his argument does not actually require that such a state ever existed. So his point is not so much to say that he has somehow found the true historical account of what occurred way back in the before time, although he does claim there are some examples. He points to the American wilderness of his time, because he's writing during the time period when England is heavily involved in what they call the New World. And of course, the American Revolution is in the future relative to Locke, but his ideas become quite influential. He also looks at individuals that are outside of nations, using examples such as people who are shipwrecked, kind of a Robinson Crusoe type of scenario. And these, again, are examples he thinks reflect real cases of state of nature, but he doesn't require for his argument that the state existed historically. Also, he takes the individual to be more fundamental than the state. So the state is for the individual as opposed to the reverse. So he has that assumption, people are independent individuals, and society is a complex entity composed of individuals. So similar in many ways, of course, to Thomas Hobbes. But he differs quite a bit from Hobbes in some key areas. So here are some differences. We saw when we looked at Hobbes' state of nature that it is a war of all against all. It is awful. Locke's state of nature is, by contrast, pretty good. It's a state of peace, goodwill, mutual assistance. This state includes various rights, including property rights and life, etc. And in this state of nature, people are governed by the law of nature. And if you were to ask both Hobbes and Locke before they were dead, is the state of nature run by the law of nature? They both say, sure, that it is. Is this something that is supported by reason? They would say, sure. Locke thought it was intelligible and plain to all. And as you probably gathered, philosophers tend to think that their views are, rational, and anybody who has any sense would agree with them. Rather like Hobbes also, individuals are free and independent, and there are, kind of unlike Hobbes though, there are natural and informal social relations. So we don't have government, but we do have, in a sense, social, I guess you really couldn't call it society because it usually implies politics, but we have social relations between people. So more about the state of nature, Locke's state of nature in terms of what it's like. So we have in the state of nature, effectively freedom, perfect freedom, which of course is exaggerating, but we are free. And we can do as we wish with our possessions. And Locke believes we have property in the state of nature and our persons, but there are limits, specifically the limits of the law of nature. Like Hobbes, if you were to ask Hobbes and Locke, are people equal in this state? They would both agree, yes, they are. But their equality is a bit different. For Hobbes, it's everyone can kill everybody, so we're all equal. Locke's has got a nicer view, that no one has power and jurisdiction over anyone else initially. And he brings in, Locke seems to have definitely believed in God, and so he has God play a role in his theory, which also makes it quite different from Hobbes. So, as he sees it, creatures of the same species are equal without subordination or subjection, unless, of course, God is given dominion. And he thinks that God has set us up with, equality. So it's a state of liberty for him, but not a state of license, that we can't just do anything. Well, we could, but it would be wrong to do so. And so he thinks that each person has a uncontrollable liberty regarding their persons or possessions. And so the rights we have in this state pre-exist civil society. They're not based on government, not based on artificial laws, courts, etc. And these are for Locke life, liberty, and you might have thought I would say pursuit of happiness, but Locke says property. And there are those, of course, who say that the founding fathers chose pursuit of happiness because you can pursue it, but you're not guaranteed to get it. And of course, they had most of the property, so they didn't want people getting ideas about their property. So why the right to life for Locke? Well, his reasoning is that humans lack the liberty to destroy themselves or anything else if a nobler use than its bare preservation requires it. That we are not free to destroy things except in very limited circumstances. So much like Hobbes, he also takes the view that reason, which he takes to be the law of nature, just sort of teaches us these things. They disagree, of course, about what reason and the law of nature is teaching us. So Locke draws the inference that since people are initially equal and independent, we shouldn't harm other people in their life, health, liberty, or possessions. Hobbes, of course, draws a rather different conclusion from what he regards as reason and the law of nature. So both appealing to reason and the law of nature, but drawing very different conclusions. So for Locke, what is the ultimate foundation of our rights? And the answer is, for Locke, God. In terms of our fundamental right to life is the fact that we're God's property. So essentially, killing other people is busting God's stuff. So Locke takes the religious view that we're God's creations and God's servants, and we're his property and this is consistent with Locke's own theory of property, because he created us according to him. And we're made, essentially to last during God's pleasure, not other people. Although clearly people can kill us, but they're not, on Locke's view, they're not supposed to. He also believes that since we have like capabilities, everything in nature we initially share equally, there's initially no subordination among us, and because of this, we have no authorization to destroy each other initially. Because we're not made for each other's uses, and Locke notes here that takes a view that we saw with Thomas Aquinas and Augustine talking about, plants and animals, that inferior ranks of creatures, plants and animals, are made for us to use, so it's okay for us to kill them and eat them. But in the case of humans, we're all equal according to Locke, so we don't exist to be harmed or killed or eaten, etc. by other humans. So the basis of the right to life is we're God's property, and hurting other people, killing them, is busting God's property. Now, Locke goes beyond just it's wrong to kill people. He also thinks that we're bound to preserve ourselves. And if you were to ask Hobbes, hey, are people obligated to stay alive? Hobbes would say yeah. Locke would say yeah as well, but for different reasons. Now, Hobbes, as we saw, takes the view that in the state of nature, it's essentially every person for themselves. Locke, though, believes even in the state of nature, we should preserve other people as much as we can. Except when, of course, our own preservation is in competition. So the idea is that unless it would get us, killed, we should preserve other people as well. So radically different from Hobbes. Hobbes pretty much allows people in the state of nature to, again, do anything. There's no limit except you got to just try to survive. But for Locke, in the state of nature, we cannot, except when it's justified, take away life, impair life, or take away people's liberty, health, limb, or goods. Because as Locke sees it, again, even in the state of nature, there is these rights: life, liberty, property. And the main reason it is for Locke is he's got God in the picture, and Hobbes pretty much does not. So he does note here that we may not do these things like harm people except for justice. So what morally justifies harming other people? And this is a good question, because what Locke's looking at, if we have a scenario where there's no government and no prisons, no courts, etc., how do we go from having none of that to having it and having it be justified? Because his concern is having a justification for this power, and not just simply, oh, these people have got like, swords are now like guns, so they can just do what they want. And it's still an important question today in terms of what justifies us in punishing other people, and what should be the purpose of our punishments, and what sort of limits should we have upon these punishments, which are still, since we still have prisons and punishments, still very important questions. Now, Locke thinks that we need to have a right to punish for very practical reasons, because very similar to Hobbes says, as we saw, that if you have a right to something, the right is effectively meaningless, and unless you have the means to exercise that right. And Locke takes a very similar view, because in the state of nature, how do we get people to not, invade other people's rights, to do harm against others? How do we get people to follow the law of nature? Because according to Locke, the law of nature wills the peace and preservation of all humans. So what justifies that? Now, today, of course, we would say in society, we talk about like the police and the laws and stuff. But again, Locke's saying, hypothetically, we don't have any courts. We don't have any police. We don't have any human-based laws. There's just people in the state of nature. Now, Locke thinks that or did because he's dead, that the execution of the law of nature is in everyone's hands. So what justifies this? Well, the justification is sort of in general is, again, rights are useless unless you have the ability to, protect them and back them up. And so someone's got to be able to do this. And in terms of how far people can go, he thinks that he uses the notion of that you can punish someone who transgresses the law of nature to the degree that hinders its violation. That's pretty vague, but the idea seems to be that it can be done to the degree that it keeps people from doing that. Then the question is like, how far can one go? So as he noted, these laws of nature would be useless, effectively would be in vain, if there was no one to protect these laws, to enforce them. So who does it? Again, we have no police here, no one's appointed to any special positions. And so his reasoning is this: if anybody in the state of nature can punish, then everyone can do so. Why? Well, we're all equal. So what anyone is justified in doing, because we're all equal, so is everyone else. And again, as he argued, the law of nature would be pointless unless there was someone to enforce it. So we need someone to enforce it. If anyone can enforce it, everyone can. So, everyone can enforce the laws of nature, these rights. And for Locke, that's how we get the right to punish others, because the rights would be useless without enforcement. Someone's got to do it. If anybody can do it, everyone can do it. So everyone's got the right to do so in the state of nature. But how far can this go? And this is still an important question today, which is, what are the limits of punishment? How far, how much should people be punished? And there's also the question of justification. What justifies it? Now, Locke puts a limit on it. He says there's no absolute or arbitrary power to use a criminal. And what is the limits? Well, he thinks essentially a punishment fits the crime type of deal. So we're allowed to punish people for retribution proportional to the transgression. Basically, the punishment proportional to the crime. And then the question is like, how do we measure that out? Are we doing like an eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth, or what are we doing? And he gives a little more detail that you can punish as much as needed for two things: reparation, which is compensating or paying back for people for the harm done to them, and restraint, which is essentially deterrence or keeping people from doing it. So essentially reparation, compensating people for harms, and deterrence. And he claims those are the only two justifications morally for doing harm to other people: reparation for harms done, or to deter, to restrain people from doing harm. Now, he has more to say about punishment as well. Locke continues his discussion of punishment by providing further justification for it. Being a philosopher in a particular tradition, he likes to pretty much argue for every point he makes. So, additional justification is this. Locke thinks that when someone breaks a law of nature, the person who does this rejects the rule of reason and the rule of common equity. So, what is this rule? He thinks it has a divine origin, that God, put forth this measure for our actions, for our security. So God basically lays down these rules. So the foundation of his theory of rights is that it's a natural right theory, but for Locke, God is behind this rule created by him. So if someone breaks the rule of God, these rules, they become dangerous to humanity. And he thinks because we have a right to preserve mankind, we can restrain or, if necessary, destroy noxious things. So if someone transgresses, this law that Locke thinks, laid down by God, that requires, not hurting other people, not harming them in their life, liberty, or property. If someone does that, then other people are justified to, punish them to a degree that makes them repent, agree that deters them from doing it again, and by their example of the punishment to them, deters other people. So the aspects here are essentially repentance, and in some, criminal justice systems, there is often initially, like in the United States, a desire to get people to repent, hence a penitentiary system to repent and to become better. And we've kind of given up on that for the most part. And of course, the justification is deterrence for the person who does the crime so they won't do it again. And the usual justification, one of the common justifications for punishing people, is that not only deterring them from doing it again, but also that other people will see and decide that they don't want to do that because of the punishment. And so Locke thinks that this justifies that every person has a right to punish people, because again, without having enforcers for the law of nature, it's meaningless, and hence, someone has to do it. If someone can do it, we all can do it. So we're all basically, as I like to jokingly say, in the state of nature, we're basically all God's vigilantes. We're like God's, Batman, and enforcing God's law. Now, so far we've looked at primarily deterrence. There's also, he mentioned, reparation. So misdeeds often result in injury and harm. The person is injured, their property is damaged or taken, and Locke thinks that a person who's harmed in these misdeeds, of course, has the right of punishment, and he thinks everyone has this as well. But he thinks that the person who's harmed in these misdeeds gets an additional right, which is because if they've suffered a loss, property, etc., they have a right to seek reparation from the person who injured them, to compensate. And Locke thinks that anyone else, of course, can assist them in recovering, this compensation, but of course, only the person harmed has the right to that compensation. And have you ever seen, commercials put forth by lawyers? They often have appeals like, do you believe you're entitled to compensation? And this is a notion that's still around today, that in certain, offenses, people are entitled to compensation, to reparation for their injury. And this is a view that not everyone accepts. Some people are strictly into the deterrence thing. Some people are just entirely into, which Locke doesn't mention, retribution, just harming people because they've harmed someone else, with the whole point of just seeking retribution. And Locke focuses on reparation, compensating for harms done, and deterrence. That's his theory of punishment. Now, what about more punishment? Well, one standard moral topic that has been written about and discussed in probably every ethics class ever is, of course, capital punishment. So, what's Locke's stance on capital punishment? Well, his view is, at least in the case of punishing murderers, that it is justified. In the state of nature, he thinks everyone has the power, the right to kill someone who is a murderer. Now, someone might say, but wouldn't that make them murderers? Because if they kill someone, aren't they a murderer? And of course, philosophers are careful to point out typically that although murder is killing, not all killings are murder. And so Locke believes that killing itself is not inherently wrong, but murder would be wrong, which would be, an unjust, wrongful killing. So what's the justification for killing a murder? Well, if you've ever heard debates today about capital punishment, these will probably sound quite familiar because they're pretty standard arguments today with, kind of a Lockean flavor to them. So the first, of course, is deterrence. Now, obviously, if a murderer is killed, they're not going to do it again. So that deals with that particular, issue. But the idea is that since there can be no reparation for murder for the person killed because they're dead, we can't, raise dead or resurrect them, at least currently. And so reparation for the victim, the person killed, cannot be claimed. So the only thing here would be deterrence. So the idea is, you still hear this today, that if we kill murderers, then people will say, gosh, I'm not going to do a murder because I don't want to be killed. And of course, the obvious thing is that the murderer is killed, and therefore they're not going to do that again. And Locke thinks that when someone does murder, they've declared war against everyone. And so the justification is they can be destroyed as if they were a wild beast because they're acting like one. So he then turns to this religious justification when he takes this to be the ground of the basis, foundation of a great law of nature, which is this: whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. And again, you may think, isn't that murder for murder? And again, there's a distinction made here between someone who murders someone, kills someone unjustly and wrongly, and killing someone. One can, of course, take issue with the idea of, justified killing, but Locke does draw that distinction. So killing a murderer justly does not make one a murderer, at least in Locke's theory. So next we'll pick up with more of John Locke, but for now, stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.